You've heard of U-boats. You've probably seen the movies, the grainy black and white footage, the cramped corridors, the tension, the depth charges exploding overhead. But there's a part of the U-boat story almost nobody talks about. Something that happened not during the patrol, not in the heat of battle, but after. Every single time a German submarine returned from a mission, no matter how brutal, no matter how many men they lost, no matter how damaged the boat was, the commander had to sit down and write. Not a letter home, not a casual debrief, a complete, exhaustive, methodical record of everything that happened from the moment they left port to the moment they came back. Every torpedo fired, every ship sighted, every decision made, every depth charge survived, every meal served. The weather, the currents, the mechanical failures, the crew's morale, the conversations with other submarines, the orders received, the orders ignored, and sometimes the orders that got men killed. This document was called the Kriegstagebuch, the War Diary, and it wasn't optional. It wasn't a suggestion from high command. It was a non-negotiable requirement of German naval doctrine, enforced with the kind of institutional seriousness that only the Third Reich's military bureaucracy could produce. Every patrol, every commander, every boat, no exceptions. And then, once it was written, once every page was filled and every entry accounted for, a copy had to be sent to command. Not delivered in person, not summarized in a meeting, physically transmitted, reproduced, and forwarded up the chain of naval authority so that the men at the top, the admirals, the strategists, the intelligence analysts, could read exactly what happened out there in the Atlantic. Right now, if you're the kind of person who finds this fascinating, if you want to know the real stories behind the machinery of World War II, the systems, the strategy, the human cost, then make sure you subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of thing we dig into here. Every week, all the way down to the details that the textbooks leave out. Now, let's get into this. Because the story of the Kriegstagebuch is really the story of how the German Navy tried to fight a war not just with submarines and torpedoes, but with information. And understanding why they did it the way they did, understanding what these documents actually contained, and what happened when they were captured, changes everything you thought you knew about the Battle of the Atlantic. To understand why the War Diary system mattered so deeply, you have to understand the U-boat campaign itself, at its most fundamental level. The German submarine fleet, the Unterseeboot, was not just a weapon, it was a strategy. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder and later Admiral Karl Dönitz believed with absolute conviction that Germany could strangle Britain into submission if it could cut off the Atlantic supply lines. Britain was an island nation. Everything it needed to fight, oil, food, weapons, raw materials, came by ship across the ocean. Sever those supply lines, and you win the war without ever setting foot in London. That was the theory, and for a while, it worked. In the early years of the war, especially in 1940 and 1941, U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be built. The period U-boat crews called the Happy Time, the Glückliche Zeit, saw submarines operating almost without restriction in the Atlantic, picking off convoys with devastating efficiency. Dönitz was running Wolfpack operations, where multiple submarines would converge on a convoy and attack simultaneously, overwhelming the escorts and sinking ship after ship in the same night. But here's the thing about Wolfpack warfare. It required coordination on a scale that had never been attempted before in submarine history. You weren't just sending a single submarine out on an independent mission and waiting for it to come back. You were managing dozens of submarines simultaneously across millions of square miles of ocean. You were giving them patrol zones, redirecting them based on convoy intelligence, ordering them to converge on specific grid coordinates, telling them to break off attacks and relocate. You were running a real-time naval campaign from a bunker in France using radio signals and coded messages. And that meant you needed information. Constant, detailed, accurate information about what every single submarine was doing, seeing, experiencing, and surviving. Because without that information, you were flying blind. You couldn't improve tactics. You couldn't identify what was working and what wasn't. You couldn't figure out why one commander was sinking 6 ships per patrol and another was coming home with all his torpedoes still in the tubes. You couldn't know where the convoy routes were shifting, where the Allied air cover was thickening, where the new escort tactics were catching submarines off guard. The Kriegstagebuch was the solution to all of that. It was the mechanism by which U-boat command turned operational chaos into usable intelligence. And it was far more sophisticated than it sounds. The war diary was not a journal. It was not a captain writing down his feelings at the end of a long day. It was a structured, standardized document with specific required entries organized chronologically. Every event that occurred during the patrol had to be logged with its exact time and date. Not approximately, exactly. The format was precise because precision was the whole point. A commander might begin an entry at 0347 hours and note that a contact had been made on a convoy bearing northwest at a range of approximately 12 kilometers. He would then record the weather conditions, the sea state, the wind speed and direction, the visibility, the moon phase if it was night. He would record the submarine's position in the German naval grid system, the quadrant code that could be translated to exact coordinates by anyone at command who had the reference charts. Then he would describe the convoy. How many ships, what types, their formation, their speed, their heading. He would note the number and type of escort vessels, where they were positioned, how aggressive they appeared, whether they were using searchlights, whether they had radar. Then he would describe the attack, which torpedoes were fired, from which tube, at what time, at what target, with what settings on the depth and speed, whether the torpedoes ran true or malfunctioned, whether there were hits and how many, what the results looked like, how long it took a ship to sink, whether survivors were seen in the water, and then he would describe the response, the counterattack, how many depth charges, how deep, how close, whether the submarine had to dive hard and go silent, how long they stayed down, what the crew did during that time, whether there was any damage to the boat. After every exchange like this, he would document the follow-up, what he decided to do next, stay in the area and look for more targets, disengage and move to a new patrol zone, surface to recharge batteries, make a radio report to command. Every decision was recorded, and every decision had to be justified in writing. That last part is important. The Kriegstagebuch was not just a record, it was an accountability document. The commander was implicitly explaining his choices to his superiors, and those superiors would read those explanations and form judgments. A commander who broke off an attack prematurely because the depth charge response was too intense had better explain that decision clearly. A commander who stayed in a patrol zone too long without making contact had better document the conditions that justified his patience. A commander who fired all 6 bow torpedoes at a single large target and missed with 4 of them had better describe exactly why he thought that target was worth the expenditure. Because someone at Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, U-boat command, was going to read every word. And Dönitz himself often read them. That is not an exaggeration. Dönitz was famously hands-on with his commanders. He reviewed war diaries personally, annotated them, wrote responses in the margins, and used them directly to inform his tactical instructions. He knew the Atlantic through these documents. He understood the campaign not through abstract statistics, but through the accumulated first-person accounts of men who had been out there, under the water, fighting for their lives while also keeping meticulous records of every strokes of operational luck, managed to crack the naval enigma codes intermittently throughout the war. And when they could read the traffic, they could route convoys around wolf packs, redirect escort forces to intercept surface submarines, and build a detailed picture of where the U-boats were and what they were doing. But here's what makes the physical war diaries even more important in this story. Cryptanalysis is powerful, but it's incomplete. You can read an encoded message that says a submarine is at grid square BE 6492 and has sighted a convoy. That tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything the commander observed, everything he thought, every detail he recorded in his war diary during those same hours. The war diary told the whole story, which is why the Allies were desperately interested in capturing U-boat war diaries intact, and on several occasions they did exactly that. The most consequential of these captures happened in 1941. On May 9th of that year, HMS Bulldog, a British destroyer escort, was hunting a U-boat that had been forced to the surface by a depth charge attack. The submarine was U-110, commanded by Kapitan Lieutenant Julius Lemp. As the British closed in, the German crew abandoned ship, believing the submarine was sinking. Lemp himself died in the water, the exact circumstances still debated by historians. But U-110 did not sink. Not immediately. The British boarded her before she went down, and what they found inside changed the course of the war. They captured an Enigma machine with its rotors still in place. They captured the current key settings, the code books, the operating manuals, and they captured the submarine's Kriegstagebuch. The intelligence haul from U-110 was so significant that the British went to extraordinary lengths to keep it secret. They didn't want the Germans to know that the submarine had been boarded and her secrets taken. Because if the Germans suspected their codes were compromised, they would change them, and all the advantage gained would be lost. The captured war diary gave Bletchley Park context for the signals traffic they had been reading. It helped them understand the German grid system more precisely. It helped them correlate coded messages with actual events. It was a Rosetta Stone for the naval war in the Atlantic. And it wasn't the only one. In May 1941, HMS Somali captured weather reporting equipment and documents from a German weather ship, München. HMS Tartar captured similar materials from another weather ship, Lauenburg. These weren't submarines, but they carried Enigma equipment and coded materials related to naval operations, some of which overlapped with the systems U-boats used for their communications. Later in the war, as the U-boat campaign intensified and Allied anti-submarine capabilities improved, there were more opportunities for captures. Some were operational successes, organized boarding actions on damaged submarines. Others were the result of submarines being forced to surrender or sinking slowly enough for documents to be recovered from survivors or from the wreckage itself. Each capture added to the Allied picture of how the U-boat campaign worked at the operational level. Not just what the submarines were doing, but how U-boat command was directing them, what their patrol areas were, what their attack methods were, how Dönitz was thinking about the campaign. The war diaries were a window into the mind of the enemy's submarine strategy. From the German side, the war diary system served a function that went beyond just operational intelligence. It was also a tool of command culture. Karl Dönitz was deeply invested in the psychological and professional development of his submarine commanders. He came from a submarine background himself, having commanded U-boats in the First World War, including surviving the loss of his own submarine. He understood the unique pressures of submarine warfare in ways that surface fleet admirals often did not. He believed that good commanders were made, not born, and that one of the primary ways to develop good commanders was through systematic feedback on their performance. The war diary was central to that feedback loop. When Dönitz or his staff read a war diary and found that a commander had made an error in judgment, they didn't just note it privately, they addressed it, sometimes in direct written correspondence, sometimes in the formal debrief that followed a patrol, the so-called front report conference. Sometimes in the operational orders issued for the next patrol, which would include specific guidance correcting the problems identified in the previous war diary. The best commanders received praise, often explicitly, in the form of commendations that referenced specific decisions documented in their war diaries. The worst commanders, or those who showed a pattern of poor decisions, could be reassigned, retrained, or simply not given another boat. The war diary was the evidence on which those judgments were made. This created a particular kind of pressure for submarine commanders. They knew they were writing for an audience. They knew Dönitz read these documents, and that knowledge shaped how they wrote. Some commanders were meticulous to an almost compulsive degree, logging every minor detail with the seriousness of a scientist recording experimental data. Others adopted a more narrative style, explaining their thinking in longer passages that read almost like the reasoning of a chess player describing their moves. A few were terse to the point of curtness, giving facts and nothing else. But all of them understood that what they wrote in the war diary was a direct line of communication with their superiors. Not an indirect report passed through an intermediary, but a first-person document that their admiral would read in their own words. There's a dimension to the war diary system that gets very little attention in most histories of the U-boat war, and that's the human element of what was being recorded. These were young men, most of them in their 20s and 30s, sitting in the cramped control room or the commander's tiny cabin of a steel tube 50 meters underwater, trying to describe experiences that were genuinely at the outer edge of human endurance. A depth charge attack on a submarine was not an abstract tactical event. It was a physical and psychological ordeal of an intensity that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not been through it. The submarine would dive and go completely silent. Every electrical system that made noise would be shut down. The crew would stand or sit perfectly still in the darkness, barely breathing, listening to the sound of the ship's propellers above them growing louder. And then the charges would start going off. Not the distant rumble of a movie soundtrack, but an instantaneous, overwhelming physical shock that would throw men off their feet, shatter instruments, burst pipes, short-circuit electrical panels, and fill the interior with the smell of leaked battery acid and the sound of metal under stress. Some crews endured this for hours, some for days. Cases are documented of U-boats under sustained attack for more than 20 hours, unable to surface, unable to move, running out of oxygen, with water seeping through stressed hull welds and men collapsing from heat and fear and carbon dioxide poisoning. And when it was finally over, when the propeller sounds faded and the depth charges stopped and the commander decided it was safe to move, somebody had to write it all down, not later, after a good night's sleep and a hot meal. Right then, or as close to right then as possible, because the war diary required that events be logged contemporaneously or as close to it as the situation allowed. Commanders wrote about depth charge attacks while their hands were still shaking. They described mechanical failures while the repair crews were still working on them. They recorded crew losses in the same clinical format they used for everything else: name, rank, circumstances, time. The emotional content of these entries varies enormously from commander to commander. Some were almost impossibly detached, describing the death of crewmen in language as dry as an inventory list. Others let something through in the phrasing, a word chosen carefully enough to signal grief or horror while staying within the formal requirements of the document. A few commanders wrote passages that are genuinely powerful as first-person accounts of combat, describing moments of clarity and decision in the middle of chaos, with a precision that makes you feel like you're standing next to them. The war diaries of commanders like Otto Kretschmer, the highest-scoring U-boat ace of the war, are remarkable for this quality. Kretschmer was known for his tactical innovation, his insistence on attacking convoys from inside the escort screen at close range, firing single torpedoes rather than salvos. His war diaries reflect this methodical, precise approach to warfare. Reading them, you can see how his mind worked, how he assessed risk, how he calculated angles and speeds and expected targets, how he made the decisions that made him so devastatingly effective until HMS Walker and HMS Van Ock caught him on the surface in March 1941 and forced him to scuttle his boat. The war diary of his last patrol, the one that ended with his capture, is a remarkable document. It describes the attack, the depth charging, the decision to surface, and the order to abandon ship in the same precise, controlled language as every other entry, right up until the moment he could no longer write. There were also commanders who clearly struggled with what the war diary required of them, men who had lost their nerve after too many patrols, who were writing accounts of timid decisions that they knew Donitz would criticize, who were constructing post hoc justifications for choices made out of fear rather than calculation. Donitz was good at seeing through these. His annotations on war diaries could be pointed and harsh. Phrases like, "This decision was too cautious," or "The commander should have pressed the attack," appear in his margin notes with some regularity. The war diary system made the command relationship between Donitz and his submarine commanders uniquely direct. There was no intermediary filtering or softening the information that reached the top. The admiral read the commander's own words and responded to them in his own words. In an era before instant communication, before satellite uplinks and digital reporting systems, this was as close to real-time accountability as the military technology of the time could produce. The sheer volume of information generated by the war diary system was staggering. By 1942, the U-boat force had grown to more than 100 operational submarines, with more being commissioned every month. Each of these boats was conducting patrols of anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months, depending on the operational area, the range of the submarine type, and the availability of supply submarines, the so-called Milchkuhe, or milk cows, that could refuel and rearm boats at sea. Each patrol produced a war diary. Each war diary ran to dozens, sometimes hundreds of pages. Multiply that by over 100 operational submarines conducting multiple patrols per year, and you begin to understand the administrative scale of what U-boat command was managing. The staff officers at headquarters who processed these documents were doing something that would today be called data analysis, but with paper files and ink and the organizational infrastructure of a 1940s military bureaucracy. They were looking for patterns across hundreds of war diaries. Where were submarines being detected before they could attack? In which grid squares was convoy traffic most concentrated? Which escort ship types were most dangerous to the submarines? What time of day or night produced the highest attack success rates? What torpedo settings and approach angles were most effective against different ship types? This information was synthesized into regular operational bulletins distributed to all submarine commanders before each patrol. It was a feedback loop operating across the entire U-boat force. One commander's experience in the Bay of Biscay would, through the War Diary system, eventually influence the tactics of another commander operating against convoys in the North Atlantic. The War Diaries were the mechanism by which individual experience became collective doctrine. And doctrine in the U-boat war was not static. The entire nature of the campaign changed over the course of 4 years, and the War Diary system had to accommodate those changes. In the early years, the Atlantic was the primary theater, and convoy attacks were the primary mission. But as the war progressed and Allied anti-submarine capabilities improved, U-boats were sent to increasingly distant operational areas: the South Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, the waters off West Africa, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic supply routes to the Soviet Union. Each of these theaters had its own conditions, its own challenges, its own intelligence requirements. Arctic patrols were particularly brutal. The War Diaries from submarines operating against the convoys to Murmansk and Archangel describe conditions that add a new dimension to the already extreme hardships of submarine warfare. Temperatures so cold that spray froze on the deck and the conning tower, equipment failures caused by the extreme cold that were not anticipated in the submarine's design specifications, navigation challenges created by magnetic compass unreliability at high latitudes. The psychological weight of near-constant daylight in summer, which eliminated the nighttime darkness that gave submarines their best chance of surface attack. Commanders writing these war diaries were dealing with an environment that was actively trying to kill them independent of any Allied action, and they had to document all of it with the same methodical rendezvous points in the open ocean. Coordinating a milk cow rendezvous required multiple submarines of the Atlantic had turned decisively against the U-boats. The combination of better Allied radar, longer-range aircraft, improved escort tactics, the introduction of escort carriers, and crucially, the increasing ability of Bletchley Park to read the Enigma traffic in near real time had created conditions where U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. May 1943, which became known as Black May, saw the Germans lose 41 submarines in a single month. Dönitz withdrew the remaining boats from the North Atlantic. The War Diary entries from the survivors of Black May describe experiences of almost unimaginable intensity. Submarines under air attack in waters where they had once operated with impunity. Depth charge attacks that began within minutes of surfacing because the Allies now had radar that could pick up a submarine schnorkel at long range. Boats that went out on patrol and simply never came back. Their war diaries ending in mid-patrol at whatever point the commander last made an entry before the boat was lost. The incomplete war diary of a lost submarine is a particularly haunting artifact. These documents, when they survive at all, because some were recovered from wreckage or survivors, sometimes trail off in the middle of a routine entry, a weather observation, a position report, a notation about a mechanical fault in one of the torpedo tube mechanisms, and then nothing. The patrol is simply over, ended by whatever killed the boat and everyone aboard. The Allies learned from this too. Analyzing patterns in where and when submarines stopped transmitting, cross-referenced with their war diaries' last entries, helped build intelligence about where U-boat losses were occurring and what was causing them. The war diary became one of the most intensively studied collections of military documents in history. The British and Americans collect the British Admiralty produced comprehensive analyses. The United States Navy established its own studies. The documents that had been captured during wartime operations, the materials from U-110 and other prizes, were integrated with the post-war archive to produce the most complete possible picture of how the U-boat campaign had been conducted. One of the central projects was the creation of what became known as the U-Boat Command War Diary, a master document compiled from all the individual submarine war diaries and the headquarters records, essentially reconstructing the entire operational history of the U-boat force from beginning to end. This work was carried out partly by former German naval officers under Allied supervision, men who had the technical knowledge to interpret the documents and the access to fill gaps in the record. It produced a historical resource that remains foundational to naval history scholarship today. The level of detail in the surviving war diary collection is extraordinary. Researchers can trace individual submarines through their entire operational histories. They can read the war diary entry in which a commander describes making contact with a convoy that another commander, in a different war diary, describes attacking that same night from a different angle. The two accounts can be compared against the Allied records of the same convoy action, producing a three-dimensional picture of a battle seen from multiple perspectives simultaneously. This kind of documentary depth is rare in military history. Wars are usually understood through the records of the victors, through official after-action reports and headquarters diaries that describe events at a level of institutional abstraction. The U-boat war diaries provide something different. They provide the individual human perspective, thousands of individual human perspectives, captured in the moment, in the words of the men who were living it. The war diary requirement also intersected with German naval law in ways that had significant post-war consequences. Because the war diaries were official legal documents, they were potentially admissible as evidence in war crimes proceedings. The question of whether U-boat commanders had violated the laws of naval warfare, particularly around the treatment of survivors of sunken ships, was one of the central issues at the Nuremberg trials. Admiral Karl Dönitz himself was tried at Nuremberg and convicted, though his sentence of 10 years was relatively lenient compared to other defendants, in part because the Allied prosecution's own evidence showed that Allied navies had also engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare in the Pacific. The war diaries played a role in this. They contained entries that described specific incidents involving survivors. In some cases, entries that documented the decision not to assist survivors, which was standard practice across all submarine forces once the war at sea became too dangerous for submarines to surface near a sinking ship. In a very few cases, entries that described something more troubling. The Laconia incident of 1942 is the most infamous example. U-156, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein, sank the British troopship Laconia, not knowing it was also carrying over 1,000 Italian prisoners of war who were German allies. When Hartenstein discovered the mistake, he began rescuing survivors, surfacing in broad daylight and towing lifeboats while broadcasting a message in plain English that he was engaged in a rescue operation and asking for assistance. Other U-boats came to help, and then Allied aircraft attacked, bombing the submarines that were openly displaying Red Cross flags while rescuing survivors. Dönitz responded by issuing what became known as the Laconia Order, a directive that explicitly prohibited submarines from rescuing survivors in future. He was prosecuted for this order at Nuremberg. His defense relied heavily on the argument that the order was a response to Allied attacks on submarines conducting rescue operations, and that American Admiral Chester Nimitz had issued similar instructions for Pacific submarine operations. The war diaries from the submarines involved in the Laconia incident, from U-156, from U-507 that also participated in the rescue, from the coordination signals that are preserved in the command war diary, all of these documents formed part of the evidentiary record at Nuremberg. The war diary system meant that these events were documented not in retrospect but in real time, and that documentation had legal implications that the men writing those entries could never have anticipated when they were sitting in a submarine, trying to save the lives of people they had just tried to kill. The technical details recorded in the war diaries have also been invaluable to historians of submarine technology, because the war diaries documented every mechanical failure, every weapons malfunction, every technical innovation tried in the field. They provide a continuous record of how German torpedo and submarine technology evolved and where it failed. The torpedo problems of the early war are a significant chapter in this story. In the first year of the war, German torpedoes were plagued with reliability problems that were partially documented in war diaries and partial brief entry at 1400 noting nothing to report, and then a long entry beginning at 2247 that starts with the words, "Contact established with westbound convoy bearing northeast," and continues for 3 pages. The submarine war was also a war of information and counter-information, and the war diaries are among our best evidence for how that information war was being fought from the German side. The Allies' ability to read Enigma traffic gave them strategic intelligence about where submarines were and what they were doing. But U-boat command was also trying to read the Allied side. German signals intelligence was attempting to decode Allied convoy routing communications. German agents in neutral ports were trying to gather information about convoy departures and cargo manifests. German aircraft reconnaissance over the Bay of Biscay and the western approaches was providing tactical intelligence about Allied patrol patterns. Much of this intelligence, when it reached the submarines in the form of operational orders, shows up in the war diaries as the information upon which commanders were acting. An entry might describe the commander receiving a radio signal from headquarters, indicating that a convoy was expected in grid square AK-7300 at a certain time, and the commander's decision about how to position his submarine to intercept it. When we know, from the Allied records, that no convoy was in that grid square at that time, or that a convoy was routed there based on intelligence specifically designed to mislead the Germans. We can see the information war being fought in real time through the juxtaposition of the two documentary records. The moments where Allied deception succeeded are visible in war diaries that describe submarines waiting in empty ocean for convoys that were routed around them using ultra-intelligence. The moments where German signals intelligence succeeded are visible in war diaries describing accurate interceptions of convoys that had not been revealed by Enigma, but by other intelligence means. Reading the war diaries alongside the Allied intelligence records is like reading two sides of a conversation simultaneously. It produces an understanding of the information dimension of the Battle of the Atlantic that neither record alone could provide. The war diary system also had its pathologies and its failures. Because commanders knew they were writing for an audience, and because that audience included Karl Dönitz himself, there was always the temptation to present decisions in the most favorable possible light. To describe a cautious withdrawal as a tactically necessary disengagement. To attribute a failed attack to torpedo malfunction rather than judgment error. To describe crew morale as good when it was actually deteriorating. Dönitz and his staff were not naive readers. They had access to enough war diaries from enough different commanders to develop a sense of what the documents sounded like when they were being written honestly versus when they were being written defensively. Certain stylistic patterns became associated with commanders who were avoiding accountability. Excessive technical detail about torpedo settings and entries where attacks had failed. Lengthy descriptions of adverse weather conditions in patrols where enemy contact had been sparse. Very precise accounts of the reasons for disengaging from attacks that had been broken off early. These patterns were read critically by the command staff. Dönitz's annotations on war diaries sometimes cut directly to this issue, noting that the explanation given did not fully account for the decision made, or asking questions in the margins that implied he did not entirely accept the account as written. In some cases, the debrief conference that followed a patrol was used to interrogate the commander on specific entries, to probe behind the written account for what had actually happened. The war diary created a paper trail that could be examined and cross-examined. It was not possible to simply claim that nothing had happened on a patrol if the war diary showed that contacts had been made but not pursued. The entry existed, the decision existed in writing, and the writing had to be defended. The legacy of the Kriegstagebuch extends beyond the Second World War in ways that are still felt in modern naval operations. The practice of systematic patrol reporting, of requiring commanders to document their operations in detail for the use of higher command and future doctrine development, has become universal in submarine forces worldwide. The specific format and requirements may differ, but the underlying principle, that operational experience must be systematically captured and analyzed to improve future performance, is a direct descendant of the German naval doctrine formalized in the U-boat war diary system. Modern naval forces maintain classified operational logs for exactly the same reasons the German Navy required war diaries: to maintain accountability among commanders, to generate the raw data needed for tactical and strategic analysis, to create a historical record that can be studied in the future, to provide the evidentiary basis for after-action reviews and doctrine development. The scale and sophistication of these systems in the digital age is incomparably greater than anything available in 1942, but the function is recognizably the same. When a modern nuclear submarine completes a deployment and its operational log is reviewed by the fleet commander, when specific decisions are questioned and specific achievements are recognized, when the accumulated data from dozens of deployments is analyzed to improve performance across the force, the ghost of the Kriegstagebuch is present in that process. Because the German Navy, through necessity and institutional discipline, worked out during 4 years of desperate combat in the Atlantic what systematic operational documentation actually looks like when it is done seriously. They worked it out in real time under impossible pressure, with the stakes measured in ships sunk and men drowned, and the outcome of a world war hanging on whether or not the information generated by their submarines was collected accurately, transmitted reliably, and,